like to make a warm welcome to our newest additions to the Ready community. Those new additions include Cal State San Marcos, Sonoma State University, the AICUP Consortium, and Florida Tech. Next, we'd like to ask all participants a few questions using the polling feature. This will help the presenter learn more about the audience and cater the presentation to the attendees. So our first question is, has your institution faced a loss of research due to campus disruptions, disaster, etc.? Please select yes or no. Okay, 42% said yes and 58% said no. So I'm sure Bill will talk more about that in the webinar. Our next question is, can you currently prove and quantify a research loss due to campus disruptions if one occurs? Please select yes or no. Okay, about a 50-50 split here. That's interesting. Okay, so we will now begin our webinar. I'll start by introducing Dr. Bill Ravlin, Professor and Chair of the Department of Entomology at Michigan State University. I'm really pleased to announce him. Here are a few details about his career. Dr. Ravlin has 35 years of academic and administrative experience in research and teaching. He's been the principal and co-principal investigator on grants and contracts totaling over $17 million. Before working at Michigan State, Dr. Ravlin served in an administrative role at Ohio State University. During his time there, he helped manage the university's research enterprise recovery after a catastrophic tornado destroyed data and equipment on the Wooster Campus. Welcome, Bill. You can take it from here.
Okay, thanks very much, Annie. Let me see here. There we go. Well, thanks very much for inviting me for the webinar. This is a presentation that I've given a few times. Always varies with the audience, but it's unique.
Can I just interrupt here for a second? If you could press present on your presentation so we can see that background slide there.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
That works?
Yep, that's great. Okay,
great. Sorry about that. Well, this is a presentation that I've given to a number of different audiences. Usually it involves insurance folks or risk managers, and maybe to a lesser extent university administrators, and to a way lesser extent folks kind of outside that sphere. But it was originally developed actually as a kind of a town hall format or a workshop to develop a common dialogue between groups like forensic accountants, university administrators, insurance specialists, and faculty and students. Because early on, after we had experienced a tornado on the Wooster campus at Ohio State University, I realized that we were speaking in very different languages, and the questions that were coming forward were far beyond the usual contents type of losses. And if you've some of my other presentations, I've even used the analogy of steaks in a freezer. So we needed to have this common language, sort of an understanding on the university side of what insurers and accountants were talking about, and then an understanding on the insurance and accountant side what the university was thinking about. So, for example, there was a geneticist working on tomatoes, and she had done a lot of work with unique lines of tomatoes, and maybe had 100 very unique genetically modified plants in a greenhouse. And once that greenhouse was destroyed, those plants were Many of them were lost, and others I still remember being in the greenhouse with a hard hat and picking the plants out and handing them to her through the broken glass. But the questions that arise as a result of that are really, what's the value of those plants? What's the value of the time lost? What's the impact on her program, both short and long term? And is there impact on her career? So many other questions follow, and at that point we had to have this framework to help people understand what the task was ahead of us, eventually to regain some resources, and to help with the recovery process in general. So today I'm going to talk about I'll give you some maybe not quite in-depth understanding of what happened with the tornado that hit us in 2010, and then attack some of these questions that I just talked about. So here's basically a summary of those kinds of things, and we can come back to that as we go along. So today we'll talk about the nature of loss in agricultural and biological research, issues associated with translating loss into dollars and ultimately an insurance claim, and then some synthesis and lessons learned as a result of that. And as Annie mentioned, questions and answers. I thought it was interesting in the polling that 42% had faced a loss, and somewhere along the line there, 48% said they could prove and quantify the loss. So I'll be interested to see what the questions are after I walk through my presentation today. So let's start with a little bit of history here and just some context. Disasters are not new to higher education, and when I'm saying disasters, they can be natural disasters or human caused, or mechanical failures and so on. So we're not restricting this to it really doesn't matter if you have water damage from a tornado or water damage because a pipe broke. But at any rate, here you see a whole series of them ranging from the year 2000 in Seton Hall to the 2010 tornado at Ohio State, and of the Seton Hall and Kansas State and Iowa and Texas medical branch, talking primarily about damage to infrastructure, buildings, those kinds of things. And then when you see the 2001 Tropical Storm Allison at U of T School of Medicine, and the laboratory fire in Santa Cruz, you begin to see some comments about loss of irreplaceable human genome project research, and the disruption, if not elimination, of 14 years worth of work. And then down at the bottom, I highlight in the green there the loss of facilities, biological materials, program delays, and revenue. And the revenue idea came in as a result of my discussions with the insurance folks and forensic accountants, and this whole idea of business continuity planning. So the idea of BCP runs through this, and hopefully that'll generate some discussion and some questions. Another part of this is focusing in on, this is on Katrina in 2005. We had a whole series of universities that were impacted, Dillard, Southern, Tulane, New Orleans, and for some reason I don't have Xavier on here, but they all suffered some kind of a loss. And this table here shows the primarily the impact on the teaching enterprise. So you can see that with Dillard, for example, there were 700 students living and taking classes in the Hilton Hotel. Finally, by January 06, they were probably still operating out of there, but they only had 50% enrollment. So they took quite a hit on enrollment, at least at that early stage. And you can see the same kinds of things going on there through the other institutions as well. And so these impacts can have a devastating effect on universities after the event, obviously, and even long after the event. So if you were listening to the news last week, I heard that the Department of Education Department forgave over $300 million in loans to this group of universities as a result of Hurricane Katrina. So even as late as 2018 now, from 2005 to 18, they're still recovering from those events. So in most of these examples, though, they tend to acknowledge research, and they say that it's very valuable, but the focus is on human life and injury, which obviously makes perfect sense, on facilities, and then on endpoints of programs such as classes missed, materials, enrollments, etc. So it usually encompasses that type of those types of areas. But the idea of what was the value of the research lost, for example, in the previous slide, the 14 years lost, what was the value of that? So some of that runs through here. So I'll touch on all of these as we move along. So let's go move on to the event that I was involved with. I was based at the Wooster Campus of Ohio State University. It's a very large research-focused area, about 2,000 acres, about 2,000 faculty, staff, and students. Here you get a little lay of the land with different types of buildings and the spread of the campus and so on. From a research standpoint, the things that stick out to me are that we had down in the lower right, you see a molecular and cellular imaging center. So here you had DNA sequencing equipment, electron microscopes, and a whole series of other very high-level equipment worth millions of dollars. We had a university private industry innovation center, so we had companies on campus. We had a plant and animal containment facility, a $25 million facility there. And then what we call a feedstock processing facility where we worked on bioenergy and bio-based products. So lots of infrastructure and a highly varied set of buildings and programs. So September 16, 2010, around 5:30 in the afternoon, many people had left the campus. And at least in the part that you see here, there was probably about 50 people on campus, and including myself. And I was in the building in the lower left corner. It's kind of got a red brick surrounded by trees. And I noticed that the weather was starting to pick up, and I was getting ready to leave, and my wife called and said, you know, did you see the weather? I said, yeah, in fact, I'm gonna hang around here for a little bit longer. I don't really feel like getting wet as I walk out the parking lot. So I waited another bit, and within 30 seconds, the tornado siren went off, and within about another 30 seconds, the entire end of the building exploded, literally. Which was quite a surprise, as you can imagine. And so we were hit by a 130-mile-an-hour tornado, and I was in the first building to be struck by the tornado. So if you look at it from the tornado standpoint, down there's my building. You can't see me in there, but I was in there. The tornado traversed across the campus, and the result then, and this is going to be a couple weeks later, was this. So we had extensive damage throughout the middle of the campus. You can see in this case, like I say, it was a bit later, so we had a chance to clean up the trees and the debris and so on. But you can see the damaged greenhouses, boarded up buildings, off in the northeastern corner there. There was a research and education arboretum, and so on. So it kind of cut a diagonal across the campus. Here's just another view to show you. On the bottom right corner is an engineering building that sustained really complete destruction, and eventually we had a new building built. So you get a better idea. And this was very soon after the event, so you can still see trees laying on the ground and so on. And they're putting up in the upper left corner, you see they're putting up telephone poles and trying to restore power to the campus. So that was the event. Just as a sidebar, here's upper left was my office, which was nice. There's a little bit of ceiling tile on the table, but it looked pretty good. However, my colleague right next door didn't fare so well. So that was the one on the upper right was his office, and the lower image is the hallway right outside my office. So I guess I was living right that day. So I got to watch and didn't have to have the ceiling literally falling on my head. So the key questions, as we that's the poor guy that usually is in the spotlights talking to the reporter in the rain down in the lower right. Key questions that we had to begin to address is from an insurance perspective is first, what is business continuity, and then secondly, is there an analog in a research context? Because what we, again, going back to my steaks in the freezer analogy, you can think about losing contents, but in a research context, is there a business analog? Secondly, along the lines of that, then what's the nature of revenue generation from a business standpoint and a research standpoint? Can we prove that there was lost revenue due to the disruption? How does disruption relate to restoring business? And what's required to bring business back online? So we quickly got thrown into the business world and insurance and forensic accountants trying to translate our loss into a business kind of a model. So when you boil all that down and you talk to a forensic accountant, they really have three questions. Did you suffer a loss? Can you prove and quantify what you lost? And are your losses covered by your policy? So we'll kind of, those three questions will run through this entire presentation. So let's look first at if you're going to understand the research, quote, business, you need to understand the research enterprise and all that goes along with it. So in this graphic here, the two areas circled are kind of the main hubs of activity. On the left side is infrastructure, so that's the campus and the facilities that I described in the one slide earlier. The molecular and cellular imaging center, the engineering labs, equipment, instrumentation labs, and greenhouses, and so on. And those are funded typically by state and federal dollars. So in this case, the state of Ohio and the federal government provide dollars, and we invested those in the infrastructure of the campus. And then those in turn support faculty level programs, specific programs where they are charged with getting grants and contracts to run their research programs. And in very real terms, they are implementing, they have a small business of their own. So they do not receive dollars directly from Ohio State University or anyone without writing a grant or developing a contract. So anything that they're given a salary, a place to work, and as I say, a hunting license to get money to develop their programs, that in turn pays for students and technicians, generates materials and knowledge. They do analyses and syntheses, and then finally, as a result, generate more grants and contracts, generates knowledge, processes, theses, new educators and scientists, and so on. And some are involved commercial products as well. So this is kind of the academic research enterprise and how it's put together. So let's look at infrastructure, and I talked about what the campus has available. This is one example here, but I think it really is a very good one and helps explain the situation. So a lot of the chemicals and reagents, plants, animals, and biological materials like DNA are maintained in -80-degree freezers. And so it allows us to maintain those materials over many years, in fact. And so these freezers are in almost every lab in any biological laboratory in the country. They most often have a backup power system. So ours were powered by the campus electrical grid, and then with the advent of the tornado, that grid was taken out of play, but they had a backup system with natural gas, which kicked in immediately until we realized we had a natural gas leak and stood a chance of having a major explosion on campus. So we had to turn off the natural gas, which then caused the freezers to thaw. So if you look at the graph on the right side there, what happens is that we're purchasing chemicals and reagents and other materials and loading them in the freezer, much as you would food at your own home. And then in addition to that, we're generating biological materials. So we may extract DNA, enzymes, and other materials that go in there. So you have the line on an angle there indicates the amount of materials that are purchased plus generated over time. With a disruption like the tornado and the thawing of the freezers, all those materials basically go to zero. So now you have a situation where you have to figure out what you're going to do. So there's a response period of anywhere from days to months. And then as dollars become available in one way or another, you begin to purchase materials once again, generate materials once again, and you get to a certain point, realizing that with the biological materials, there's going to be some material that cannot be replaced. So you already lost something that may be extremely valuable in putting together the next grant proposal and getting funding to fund your, as I made the analogy earlier, your small business. So this is kind of what happens with the infrastructure and from just the freezer standpoint alone. Same sort of a situation with instrumentation. In this case, think about things like microscopes, computers, gas chromatographs, mass specs, DNA sequencers. And so here you have data being generated over time. Tornado hits, data generation goes to zero. There's a response period, and we begin then to purchase new equipment. Well, some of the equipment can be purchased and brought online almost immediately, usually a microscope, but not necessarily regular microscopes. But if you look at the image in the left there, that's an electron microscope that would require probably easily a month to, well, probably 3 months to acquire, set up, calibrate, and probably receive training, because it's going to be a new one where we had to replace one that was probably 10 or more years old. So there's more delay going on there until you're finally back up and running and generating data that go into the major outputs of our research programs. One of the unique aspects of the Wooster Campus is the Seacrest Arboretum. It's a research and education arboretum, somewhere around 100 acres. During you can see the results of the tornado with all the broken trees and downed trees and so on in the background there, and all the way up into the foreground with the older house and the trees tipped over. So what we really didn't anticipate early on that we were going to be able to recover too much there, because we're not dealing with freezers, and we're only dealing with buildings to a limited extent. But what we really lost were the trees. So if you look at the track of the tornado across campus, from the lower left to the upper right, each one of the red shading indicates the path of the tornado and its impact as it move out from the sides. And then those red dots indicate individual trees. We visited each individual tree that was damaged, and recorded the GPS coordinates for each of those trees. And along with that, we recorded its diameter, its species, the condition of the tree before the tornado, its location, and then we're able to calculate a landscape value for it as though it were in a neighborhood using a tool called iTree. And this is something that can be used even with the IRS to quantify the value of trees in urban settings. So if you take, for example, this Canaan fir, you can see that it had a diameter of 5 inches, species had a weighting factor of 0.7, condition 0.75, location of 0.8, so on. So that had a landscape value of $313.32. If you look at a red maple down here, a little bit, it's a larger tree. The weighting factor is essentially the same, but now you have $1,800 and some change as a value. So when you add up all of those 1,500 or so trees that were lost, you came up with somewhere around $1.5 million based on this valuation. Unfortunately, our policy allowed for only a $500,000 cap because it was based on a landscape value, an aesthetic value, and these trees were quite different. So in a real show of flexibility by the insurer, they allowed us to use the remaining $1 million as a deductible on our Ohio State University $1 billion policy. So we had a $1 billion policy, the deductible is $1 million, and we were able to cover the deductible with the trees alone. So this turned out to be a very valuable thing to do, and allowed us to recover, as I say, in this case, $1.5 million. Let's go on to the people portion of this. So the part of our programs in any land grant university anyway, and most higher ed programs are graduate students, masters and PhDs, and they are going to join the program and begin completing it, going through courses and starting their research projects and so on, and eventually culminating in an accepted thesis or a dissertation publication and so on. So if you look at a normal track, you can see on that curve there, the expected track looks something like that over, for a master's, say anywhere from 2 to 3 years, and for a PhD, usually somewhere around 4 or 5 years. So if you introduce a tornado into the situation, now you have that response period again, and there's a delay in completing the degree presumably, and you wind up now with not just starting from the same spot, but a setback, and then at some point in time being able to once again start the program, recover, and the program then lasting could be anywhere from months to years even to complete the degree as a result of the disruption. So being able to recover from that and recover any dollars associated with that can be very tricky, because you have to be able to quantify that and value it with respect to the loss, and ultimately, if you look at it from a BCP standpoint, if you can, you would need to be able to do that. So the other questions that come into play here. So if your project was due to end in let's just say the end of the year, the tornado strikes in September, and now you have a 3 to 6 month delay, then are your sponsors' dollars going to extend to the end of the project, or are they going to end at the end of the year? And the answer is they usually end at the end of the agreed upon project. Each sponsor is going to be different. In our case, we contacted all the sponsors, and they were willing to give us an extension on the dollars, so that addressed the time component of that, but they didn't add any more money. So you now have a gap in the amount of money that was available and the time and so on. So, and each of these graduate students are being paid assistantships to be students in the program. So inevitably, you're going to run into some potential salary, not salary, but assistantship problems. You also have other projects and activities that are competing for time, so they can enter into the delay period as well, and that will be important from the insurance standpoint, because if you are in fact able to quantify losses here, then what's going to happen is they're going to want you to be able to talk to them about how these delays, the length of the delay, can be attributable either to can you justify the delays from the standpoint of normal operations? Was a delay in getting dollars back into the system the insurer's fault, or is there something other that created the problem? And then the one that I bring out in particular here is international students. So we have students from literally all over the world, and they are at particular risk because they're operating on visas. And so the timing of the visa may well come into play. A lot of times the sponsoring countries' dollars are going to be finite all the time, actually. And so their money may run out. So not only may their money run out, but they may have to return to their home country, which could actually mean that their whole program is eliminated. So these are the kinds of things that can come into play just from a student standpoint. Let's talk about our faculty members. This is what I call a research value chain, beginning down in the lower left with basic research. And I'm using the tomato example again here. So here you see one of our faculty members who did some really great work with tomatoes and wound up with in our world, getting the cover of Science is amazing, and she did that. But then the goal was to generate a product that was high in lycopene, and lycopene is a very important compound from the standpoint of cancer mitigation. So the problem goes all the way from identifying genes that are associated with the lycopene trait, all the way to final products that are high in lycopene. So we began there. As soon as you are able to identify those traits and produce plants, breeding comes into play. There's entomologists and plant pathologists and other pest-oriented groups are involved. Food science wants to know how well the fruits are going to be processed and whether or not they can even extract lycopene. So then there's food science, and from the nutrition standpoint and processing. And then at Ohio State, the James Cancer Center comes into play, and ultimately the commercialization folks come into play. So in the end, you wind up with this value chain. Each of these folks is getting grants and running their own small business, if you will. So here's just a snapshot of 1 year's of activity. As you can see down on the genetics one, there's in 1 year there was $574,000 generated by that professor, 586 by the breeding, 871 by the food science, and so on, all the way up to 6.2 million in the end. So when you have a disruption like a tornado and that value chain is disrupted, you can see that not only are those folks' programs affected, but all the other programs downstream are as well. So this is a significant impact, not only from the standpoint of individual programs, but from the whole institution as well. So on an individual program standpoint, you have this type of a situation here where you go from, you can see in the top graphics there, we're going literally from seeds to generating plants to extracting DNA and so on down the line. So you would get a grant to begin preparing experiments. And I'm just using 6 months as an example. It may take more or less time depending on what you do, but there's a 6-month preparation time. The experiment itself may last for another 3 months, and then you maybe do the write-up and the funding ends, and so the whole project, and just in this example, took 9 months. So the unique aspect of this is you're going to have multiple projects that overlay each other. So there isn't just one. There's usually anywhere from, I would say, 10 to 20 or so projects that are starting and stopping at different points in time. So it creates a situation that's complex because at the same time, each faculty member is writing more grants, teaching, doing outreach, they're on committees, and so on. Well, what happens then is as we introduce a disruption into this, so you have multiple projects and activities with different time frames all occurring simultaneously. They become disrupted. Again, you have there's what I'm calling a response time, and that's just trying to sort out what you need to do and begin to get things back online, and you're purchasing new equipment and so on. And so that pushes things out from that original 6 months to however long. Hard to say. It could be within weeks, could be months, could even be years. So I had a graduate student several years ago who had an equipment failure with an insect that only had 1 generation a year. So that literally meant that we had to wait an entire year before we could do that experiment again. So in the end, we wind up then with things like linkages and grant deadlines and all these sorts of things being at risk as a function of seasonality of the research and unique aspects of each individual organism. So there's quite a disruption to each one of these programs. And then on a career standpoint, here I give examples over just 4 years of 4 different types of faculty members. The very bottom one has a primarily teaching appointment with a bit of research, and you can see there that person's expenditures going from 2011 to 2014, and then all the way at the top. So those expenditures being somewhere around, I don't know, maybe $100,000. But then at the top, you have one that is in 14 was over $3 million in an annual expenditure. And then you can see the other 2 in the middle. So the point is, as that grant cycle is disrupted, as those experiments are disrupted, students may be at risk and so on, you stand the chance of disrupting those small businesses that are run by each individual faculty member, and some of it can be pretty substantial. So like I say here, the green one at the top is somewhere around $3 million, and this can be very devastating if you are a young faculty member and you haven't been tenured yet. That's your first goal, and all of a sudden you run into a disruption like this. So it can be very, very, can actually impact a career. And in fact, we had more than one faculty member on the Wooster campus that was seriously contemplating leaving Ohio State University and going elsewhere so they could reset the clock. So the key questions then that I'll come back to those. Did you suffer a loss? Well, clearly we did suffer a loss. We suffered it relative to contents and property. We had continuing expenses. The greenhouses were destroyed. and yet we still had to maintain other things like greenhouses, and so we then had to purchase some plastic greenhouses that take the place of the glass ones that wound up taking about 5 years to put back into place. And then, of course, the engineering building, which was on the order of about 5 years as well. So you had a lot of delays as a result of the physical losses. From the revenue and business continuity standpoint, quite frankly, we did not recover anything on that level. This is where BCP comes into play, I believe, and beginning a dialogue with the insurance folks to get a framework in place that would allow us to, number one, maintain data on business continuity, and then number two, be able to prove that we did in fact lose it. So if you go back to that previous slide, if we were to use, for example, expenditures as a proxy for revenue, obviously a revenue had to come in to spend it, and then it was disrupted, say, in 2013. Is there a model that would allow us on an individual program basis to recover, and we could show that there actually was a disruption in expenditures? Is there a model that would allow us to recover those dollars to put back into programs? I don't know the answer to that, and that's been the question that's been on the table in every presentation that I've given on this subject. So the revenue and business continuity issue, the topic for today, remains on the table, and in many respects we're left with steaks in the freezer, if you will. So the second point, can you prove and quantify what was lost? Again, on the physical aspects, yes, and then we were able to actually show that there were some additional expenses that were over and above the physical aspects that we did recover, but by and large, the business continuity part of it was not achieved. And then are your losses covered by your policy? I think that one's kind of a gray area because at least with our insurer at the time, I would have to say they were very, very good to work with. They were flexible. Almost all of our meetings were negotiations rather than a flat rate, if you will. And so I think that that's something to keep in mind as we experience these kinds of situations going forward. So it was very much a negotiation and not so much, here's the check, do the best you can with it. The third thing I would say along that one is that the period of recovery probably technically never ends. I showed you the slide early on with Katrina and the see how many years is it, 2005 to 2018, so you have 13 years there passed, and they were still able to recover the 322 million from that was they had on loan. So not an insurance company claim, but some of these things still can be addressed many years even after the event. But it does pay to go back and actually understand your policy. I think in the university, most people think that we're self-insured. And when you consider that you have to reach $1 million before a policy kicks in, that for the most part is true. But in our case, our total claim was around $30 million. And so we were well into well past the deductible. So at the end of the day, when you ask the question, what's the value of a tomato plant, which actually was asked by forensic accountants, that's what began to generate these ideas and simple models of trying to put a value on research and faculty time and so on, and the human element. This is particularly important, I think. So here's a risk map of natural disasters. across the United States. You've got earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, and you can see the areas, and we know about these already. They didn't add snow in here, and I think Boston might today maybe even want to throw that one into the mix. But point is that we do know those areas that are particularly at risk from these types of events. And if you overlay then the higher institutions of higher ed and research projects, public and private, then this question becomes particularly significant in those areas. I would add, however, that in the last month here at Michigan State University, you can see that that's a white area on the map, yet this is what we looked like about a month ago. And so just because you're in a high risk area doesn't mean that you don't experience these kinds of events. So that's kind of the lay of the land from the standpoint of my experience with natural disaster and some of the topics that came up in trying to close the claim and recover from that event. We, by the way, the steaks in the freezer, by the way, we did recover every last cent that we submitted from all of our researchers, including the time that it would be required to regenerate biological products such as DNA. So we estimated things like that, and the insurance company was able to, because we could document that, the insurance company was able to write the check for that. So that worked out about as well as we could hope for. But the revenue generation aspects of BCP remain to be discussed. So with that, I thank you very much, and I look forward to questions that are generated by this. Thanks very much, and I'll turn it back to Annie.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Thanks so much for sharing how you've helped campus recovery, and thanks for opening our eyes. That presentation was truly fascinating and eye-opening for me, and I bet for the rest of the attendees. I would love to know the answer to the second question that we asked just before the presentation. The question we asked about proving and quantifying a research loss. While we can't ask another polling question again because of how the platform is built, we'll send out that question in a follow-up email that all the attendees will see from us. So we'll provide a way for you to answer this question, and we'll share that with Bill.
That sounds good.
Okay, great. For the attendees, please feel free to submit a question, even if you want a personal answer. Just note it as private, and we can get back to you directly. And while we're waiting for you to submit some more questions, here's one last audience polling question. Okay, should be coming through. Here it is. When planning for a campus disruption, how long do you anticipate it would take to resume research? Okay, so it sounds like weeks and months is the most common response time until research can be resumed. So interesting. Okay, so we'll move now into the question section and ask a few questions that have been submitted. So our first question, Bill, when you were at Wooster Campus, did you have a BCP plan in place before the incident? And if so, do you feel like it helped?
Yeah, so we, in the true sense of BCP, I would say no. But we did have an emergency plan in place that we had done even to this point of having tabletop exercises. So that helped us all the way from the very instant of the event and working with first responders and those kinds of things. But from the standpoint of the claim and BCP, I'll say it was a mixed bag. In a university setting, each individual faculty member runs a fairly independent program. And as you can imagine, it runs the gamut from those faculty members who have every last item I'll use the -80 freezer example, every last item in a -80 freezer inventoried and backed up in another lab somewhere and so on, to faculty members' freezers that look like my freezer at home, where I have no clue what's in there and I just dig around. So, you know, the moral of the story is the more that you are able to document early on and quantify and record and inventory, the better off you're going to be, including what it takes to generate DNA, for example. So we actually took each type of DNA and then estimated the number of man hours it would take to regenerate that and the resources it would take. And that all went into our claim, and that worked great for the faculty that had that type of information.
Okay, great. That's a great answer. Thank you. Our next question for you, Bill, is this one. Do you have SOPs in place for an orderly lab shutdown prior to the planned incident? And how did you get buy-in from departments to complete BCP for their research?
Yeah, so that's essentially what we did have in place. Every department had to submit a communication plan in the event of disruption. They had to let people know what was the chain of command, what were the communication channels, and those kinds of things. So every department did that. It was responsibility of every department chair to get that done, and so it was a mandate. So we basically didn't give people an option to opt out. I would say that there might have been some delays, but basically that it was part of what they needed to do. So that part of it, I think, worked very well. And of course, we were very lucky in that most people had left the campus. So, but having even said that, just as an example, the one greenhouse that was destroyed completely had maybe 6 or 7 people in it at the time the tornado siren went off. Had they stayed in that greenhouse, it would not have been a very good situation. They were smart enough to know where to go, and they actually did go into the tornado area, shelter area, and we had no injuries as a result of this event. So everything went as smoothly as could it be expected on that level.
Great, thank you. The next question that we have here is, did you try to evaluate the effects on programs or research that were not directly impacted?
Let me see, that's a good question. We, following the event, I've got to go back to 2010 now. Following the event, we, in fact, did a campus-wide, put out a campus-wide, I won't call it a survey, but every faculty member was asked, whether or not something had occurred to their program. Did they lose anything? What was the nature of the disruption, and so on. And from that, we were able to identify if faculty didn't respond, then they opted out themselves rather than us discovering it. There was one particular problem where there's a lot of skepticism by faculty on whether or not they'd ever recover anything as a result of doing the needed work to identify what was lost. So we hired a person specifically to sit down with every single faculty member who had a loss, who said they had a loss, and we worked them through the process of identifying what was lost and how to quantify it. We also had at that same meeting, we had a forensic accountant. And so as a result of that, we knew that faculty might be reluctant to even venture into, they wanted to get back to work. And this was going to take some time. But so we tried to provide as much resource as possible to help them recover from that. And I believe as a result of that, we had a very good product at the end. Our claim was very solid. And in the final meeting with the accountants and the insurance company, we ventured into a discussion on auditing all of the claim. Basically, when they looked at how we did it and the fact that we had an accountant involved, they backed off on that, and also knowing that the loss was much greater than what we were claiming in, for contents. So that was how we did it.
Okay, great, wonderful answer. Thank you. We'll have one more question here, and then we'll wrap it up. Do you have MOUs with vendors to minimize disruption before replacement tools can be acquired?
The answer would be yes and no. Would depend on the nature of the loss. If you have items that are used on a regular basis, and they're going to be, at least at Ohio State, they're going to be on an approved vendor list. That'd be true here at Michigan State as well. So you wouldn't have to go through the process of approving a vendor. There might be some other things like buildings that are going to go through a lengthier process, or vehicles, or those kinds of things. So it's going to depend on the individual items and the frequency with which they're purchased.
Okay, thank you. Good to know. Attendees, we do want to be respectful of your time, and so we'll end here on the hour. Please take the next few minutes to submit any additional questions. We won't get to all of them, obviously, today as we're wrapping up, but we will work with Dr. Ravlin to make sure that all your questions are answered. And we'll post we have an upcoming blog post that we'll post in response to your questions. So watch for an email in your inbox. And that's all for today. So thank you so much. We appreciate our attendees, and thank you, Bill, for preparing and presenting today.
Thanks very much, Annie. Enjoyed it.
All right, great. Thank you all for attending, and have a great day.